My name is Stephen Dale. I'm with SCJ Alliance, and I'm joined by my colleague Steve Durow here. Steve, why don't you introduce yourself?
Good afternoon. I'm Steve Durow. I'm a senior engineer at SCJ Alliance and in the cable car division of the firm.
And myself, I'm a urban planner by trade and education, and we're with, as you know, SCJ Alliance. We're about 130 person firm based out of the Seattle region. We're a multidisciplinary planning, architecture, or landscape architecture and engineering firm. And we happen to have a specialty division of about 7 or 8 of us that focus on the cable transit division. So we've been asked by TBARTA to present just a general stakeholder engagement presentation to discuss the project and where we are and what we're doing in that. It's going to be a brief presentation, more information than anything. If anyone has a question, feel free to jump in, though I'm guessing that with this number of people, it's probably best to hold questions till the end. And feel free to just tell us what you think so that it can help shape the work that we're doing over the next, say, 6 to 8 months.
Well, so, welcome, gentlemen. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. So again, you're going to hear a lot of terminology. You're going to hear the words ropeway, you're going to hear cable car, you're going to hear gondola, you're going to hear cable transit. For your purposes, you don't really need to know what all those things mean. What you need to know is that, generally speaking, those all kind of refer to the same thing. But what we're specifically talking about here today are gondolas. So these are aerial systems supported from above. What a lot of people don't know about cable car systems is that there's a wide variety of technical configurations. There's bottom supported systems. You've probably ridden on them before and you don't even know it. A lot of airport people movers are actually cable cars. They're just propelled by a cable. And the key difference between a cable car and other traditional modes is that the cable is what's providing the propulsion. None of the vehicles are motorized. So there's a single motor that's driving multiple vehicles at one time, almost like a conveyor belt. And there's aerial supported systems where the cable's from the top, and there's bottom supported systems, as I mentioned, which are ground supported. We're not talking about bottom supported. We're talking exclusively about top supported aerial systems. And most important as well, we're not talking about chairlifts at ski hills. We're not talking about these things. Again, it's the same basic technology, but it's different. We are talking about enclosed cabins here for the purpose of this study. Already as I said, there's a couple different technical configurations, but we've narrowed down the two technologies that we would feel is appropriate in this setting. One is called the MonoCable detachable gondola, or MDG, or the TriCable detachable gondola, also known as the TriCable, the TDG. You will also hear us sometimes refer to it as a 3S. That's an industry terminology that's equivalent to TriCable. These are the two technologies that are appropriate in an urban environment where you're moving medium volumes of people and have a need for multiple stations along the route. There are other cable car technologies that can really only operate from point to point. So from A to B, they can only have 2 stations. In this situation, we determined that multiple stations was required. So we had to opt for these two technologies. The main differences between the technologies, as I said, MonoCable versus TriCable. As the name states, you can see in this picture here, there is a single cable. And that single cable provides all of the support for the system and all of the propulsion. The max cabin capacity is about 15 people, and it's wind resistant in 25-mile-per-hour winds. In fact, we've seen them operate safely in 35-mile-per-hour winds. The max speed of the technology is going to seem low to you. It's going to be about 13 miles per hour. But the key thing to understand here is that while most transit technologies are built to a higher maximum speed, that's not the appropriate metric to measure a transit technology. You have to measure the average speed. That's the appropriate way to look at it. It's like owning a Ferrari in New York City traffic. It's wonderful that your Ferrari can go 200 miles per hour or whatever that number is. But if you're in New York City traffic, you're going to be averaging like 5-6 miles per hour. And it's a similar thing with buses and streetcars and light rail, that unless you're in a fully dedicated right of way where you're not dealing with cyclists, you're not dealing with other people, you're not dealing with pedestrians or dogs or other cars, The simple reality is most transit technologies will never hit their maximum speed. So the thinking in the cable car industry is, well, why bother building it to that speed if you're never going to reach it anyways? The max span length with the technology, and these are approximates. It's really important to understand that when we talk about things like span length, and that is the distance between one tower to the next, and it varies based upon the design of the system. But as a simplifying assumption, you can assume about 1,000 feet between those towers. And the headway time range, or that is the waiting time between vehicles, we can get it down to as low as about 9-10 seconds between vehicles. Now that would be a pretty high capacity system. You'd be pushing that 3,600 person limit. And that is roughly the max capacity of what a MonoCable can offer. In our industry, we use the term PPHPD. It's equivalent to terms that are used in public transit planning, but it's not a routinely known metric, but it's very common in our industry. And what it stands for is persons per hour per direction. So it's essentially, you can think about it as like it's measuring the diameter of a pipe. How much water can you push through that pipe every hour? And that is what this number represents. And in terms of the cost of the technology, it's relatively low compared to other technologies that we're going to look at. In terms of the TriCable, as the name indicates, there are 3 ropes. And again, rope and cable are the same word in our business. And if you can see here on the upper right, you'll notice that there are 2 thicker cables on the outside. And those 2 cables act like railroad tracks. Just think of them as railroad tracks in the sky. They're fixed, they do not move. So they provide the support for the system. The thinner cable in the middle is what provides the propulsion. And that cable is moving continuously. And that's what allows the vehicle to be dragged essentially along those 2 track ropes. And that's what gives it the propulsion. The 3S is right now the most state-of-the-art technology in our industry. About, I would say, year or 2 ago, we had about 24 in operation around the world. There's probably an equivalent number being constructed right now. And Steve, if I have that number incorrect, please jump in and correct me.
No, I agree.
As discussed, number of cables, there's going to be 3, and that gives it very high wind stability. You'll notice the big jump in max wind speed, 65 miles per hour. It essentially means that in all but the worst case storm situations, this system will be operable. And the max cabin capacity is also significantly higher. It's 35 people per cabin, which if anyone who deals with transit knows, that's roughly the size of a city bus. Our max speed is also higher. It's about 17 miles per hour. And the max span length is about 10,000 feet. And this is super important to understand, especially when it comes to the Clearwater project. The Clearwater project, we know that we're going to have to cross water. And we also know that from a permitting perspective, putting a tower in the water is going to be controversial. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be challenging. So our ideal scenario, and I can't guarantee you we're going to get there, but our ideal scenario is to have no towers in the water. And to do that, we would need something like a TriCable in order to be able to do that. The headways are also still very good. Let's say 15-20 seconds per vehicle. More than likely in this scenario, we're not going to be needing this very high capacity of 5,000 ppHPD. We're probably going to be needing something on the order of about half that. So in that situation, you would probably be looking at wait times between vehicles of, let's say, 30-40 seconds. We haven't gotten to a point where we've done those calculations yet, but that's equivalent to basically with a TriCable, imagine a city bus or roughly an equivalent vehicle size of a city bus departing every 30-40 seconds. The relative cost is higher. This is of cable car technology, the most expensive technology on the market today. The key thing to understand is that you have to divorce the electromechanical equipment, which is the stuff that the cable car manufacturers build for you and install, and the station architecture. So what we see in places in the developing world that do this, because the cost of construction of buildings and stations is so much lower than here, a TriCable is much more expensive than a MonoCable. But in a place like Florida or America, where construction costs are higher, what we see is that the actual difference or delta in total project cost between the TriCable and the MonoCable is a lot more modest. Again, we haven't gotten to a point where we have any numbers to discuss. We're still at the early stages of this project, but understand that just because we say that the relative cost is high, that doesn't mean that it's going to be orders of magnitude higher than if we go with a MonoCable. In terms of station topology, we show this slide simply to tell everyone there's a wide variety of ways that stations can be designed and configured. This isn't even the beginning of what it could look like. There are stations on the 13th story of an office tower. There are underground stations. There are stations that literally go into the side of a cliff face. There's a wide variety of ways of doing this. So a lot of the time when we deal with public and stakeholders, a lot of people just really want to know what's it going to look like. And what I want you guys to know is we don't know what it's going to look like. This is not an architecture or design exercise. What we will be doing is we'll be providing indicative topologies and say, this is kind of how it would fit in this environment according to these dimensions, and then we'll cost it accordingly. But we are not going to be completing detailed architectural designs, just so everyone's aware. But again, you can see here, we have something like in the lower left where there's essentially no station, similar to the one above, which is over water, which to the top right, again, also over water, to the two station topologies that we have in the middle. These are what we call straddle stations. The top image is what's called a half straddle, which means that the vertical circulation is actually just on half the station. And in fact, this is directly connected to a subway system down below. This is in Ankara, Turkey. So within this area right here, there's actually sets of escalators, elevators, and stairs to connect people to the subway. And in this situation, this is what we call a full straddle station. And the main difference between the half and the full straddle is that we straddle both sides of the road, and vertical circulation exists on both sides of the road. One of the nice aspects of the full straddle is that you need a mezzanine level. And that mezzanine level immediately becomes a means to actually move people across wide boulevards or highways that otherwise you wouldn't be able to do, or you would have very long traffic wait times. And then you have something like this on the bottom right, which is almost a 5-story structure in Mexico City. This is a brand new, not brand new, it's about 2 years old. But they actually decorated all the stations with artwork, and they have retail facilities in there. They have restaurants, they have libraries. It's a different thing. So the point I want to make here is that what your infrastructure is for a cable car is fixed. You don't have a lot of say in terms of what is required to make a cable car work. What you do have a lot of flexibility with is the station design and where you put it. That's the place where you can really get quite creative. In terms of the general advantages and disadvantages, and again, these are all general comments. There's always going to be exceptions to the rule. But one thing that's really important to understand, this is a proven technology. There's over 20,000 systems worldwide. Now, those systems range all the way from complex public transit networks all the way down to small little ski hill tow lines that you take your grandkids to out in Colorado. But the point is that this is not a new technology. People look at cable cars and they go, oh, well, that's really new and futuristic in that, and it's not. The two suppliers of the technology that control 95% of the global market, they date from the 1880s. So those two companies literally predate every single other transit technology provider on Earth today. So this is old, proven technology. It's a quiet technology, it's sustainable. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And as we've already discussed, you can integrate it with other modes. So from a multimodal perspective, I believe someone on the call was talking about multimodality. We do not sit here and say that this is the best technology or that this is the silver bullet. This is simply one of many modes that can be integrated with one another to solve specific problems. Major advantage with the technology is the short wait times and no schedules. Anyone in public transit will tell you the single biggest hurdle to getting people out of their cars and into public transit is the wait time. Most people simply aren't going to stomach a 15, 20, 30-minute wait for a vehicle, especially not in August in Florida, right? Short wait times are what get people into transit. It's also, generally speaking, a much safer technology than standard modes. And the reason for that is pretty straightforward. You're not intermingling with other traffic. car accidents only happen because there are other cars or pedestrians or cyclists. Once you get them out of there, it's a lot safer. And because essentially we're operating in our own private right of way, it becomes a much safer technology. And again, correct me if I'm wrong on this, Steve, but there's not been a fatality, like a death in a cable car rider in North America since 1976.
That is correct. It may be 1979, but correct. And statistically, cable cars are 5 times safer than elevators. So clearly a point of comparison.
Generally, we also see that there are lower operation and maintenance costs and investment costs than other fixed link modes. And that's on an apples to apples comparison. Again, everything's going to be different. And so much of your cost profile in a system like this will be driven by the choices you make about your stations. But another major advantage that people twig to is the short installation time. A MonoCable system can be, let's say the permits have been issued, the approvals have been issued, check is in the mail. You can build a MonoCable system in less than a year, and a TriCable system can be built in less than 2 years. And that is a major, major benefit in urban environments where, we see oftentimes some of the issues that come with, these 5, 6, 7 year construction projects for whether they be highways or light rails or subways. They can have dramatic impacts on traffic, on travel times, but also on local businesses and residents who have to deal with that. We also know from the evidence, and we can share that with you in another forum, but we do know that it's far lower energy consumption than other fixed forms of transit. There's also no point source emissions, and generally we see the stations having a smaller footprint. On that lower energy consumption issue, it is important to understand the systems are powered by electricity. And electricity is not a power source. Electricity is a means of conveying power from one place to the next. So if you're burning coal to generate your power locally, then you're using coal to power your cable car. So it's not clean then. Now it's cleaner because you're using less coal, but you're still burning coal. So your green credentials on a cable car system are partly dictated on the source of the power that you're using. In terms of disadvantages, possible loss of privacy is a major one. In a North American context, you're simply not going to be able to fly over people's backyards or over their homes or privately owned pieces of land. We have seen that in certain jurisdictions. It's relatively common in Latin America, for example, but this is context specific. And one of the things that Steve Dureau and I do when we're planning these systems is we privilege this issue very highly. We feel that if you infringe upon people's residential privacy, you're going to have a very tough road ahead of you of getting any permits or approvals. So what we try and do in all but the rarest of situations is avoid that issue through good design and good choices. There's also a general misunderstanding about the technology. Let's be perfectly honest, we're talking about building a ski lift in Florida. It's a little bit weird and people are going to naturally be a little bit mistrustful and they're not going to understand. And that can translate into things like having to overinvest in things like these engagement sessions and that, so that we can deal with people and talk with people and understand their concerns. But it can also translate to very specific problems like higher insurance premiums. This has been a problem in the industry, 30 years ago, it was a bit of an issue. It's less of an issue nowadays, but it is something that we have to deal with. And this is probably the single biggest disadvantage of a cable car. And it's crucial for you to understand this. In all but the rarest situations, we cannot turn a cable car on a tower. We must turn at a station. We have no choice. And the problem with that is the vast majority of our cost is in the stations. So sort of the art and the science of designing a cable car is making sure that you don't have a whole bunch of turns that aren't doing anything except turns, if that makes sense. You want to make sure that your turning location is co-located with another node or attractor or reasons for people to get on and off the system. Otherwise, you're going to rapidly increase the cost of your system and you're going to degrade the level of service. Other minor issues, riders may have a fear of heights. There are going to be a certain percentage of people who will have that problem. Unfortunately, you can't satisfy everyone. There are going to be people who have claustrophobia issues who don't want to go underground into a subway tunnel or want to get onto a crowded bus in traffic. Unfortunately, we can't solve that for everybody. And some riders may be less comfortable in smaller vehicles. So, we talked about the MonoCable as having 15-person vehicles. Generally, they're built with 10 to 12-person vehicles. And for some people, that might be too small. It might make them uncomfortable. In the 3S situation, where the cabins are much roomier, we don't see that as much of an issue. And lastly, as we said, maximum travel speeds are lower, but that is normally offset by short headways. You have to think not in terms of just the time you're in your vehicle, but the total travel time, right? Being 10 minutes in a vehicle and having 10 minutes of wait time is no different than having 1 minute of wait time and having 19 minutes in a vehicle. And most people, generally speaking, would rather be moving than waiting. And we've already discussed this issue here. So in terms of this study, we're around here. We're doing our alternative definitions. We've already finished up our site visit. We're doing our stakeholder engagement. We're beginning our public engagement right now. And what we're going to do is we're going to define the study areas. We're very close to finishing that. And then we're going to iterate, say, 2 to 4 different alignments for each of the projects. Once we've completed that, we're going to get the projects to a technical level that we're comfortable with, that we feel that it's technically valid. And then we're going to conduct what we call a SWOT, or a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threat analysis. And we're going to go through roughly, I think it's about 24 criteria that we're going to go through. And we're supported by Stantec, Transpo, Valerian, and HRNA, who are going to assist us on those SWOTs so that we have good technical and financial backing on that. And it's going to be very qualitative. So what we're going to do is go from, let's say, three alignments for each project. We're going to conduct this first stage SWOT, and then we're going to narrow it down to one preferred alternative for each project. And then once that's complete, we're going to go through more technical validation and then do our economics and financing analysis, which is going to include ridership, fare structure, all those sorts of things. And then we're going to run the SWOT again. But the SWOT is going to be specific to each project, and it's going to be more technically rigorous and more quantitative, so more numbers-based rather than the first SWOT, which is going to be more word-based. Public and stakeholder engagement is going to be ongoing throughout this, including public events, including a project website, which should be up in the next month, I believe. And then in the first quarter of next year is our target to get to reporting and closeout. In terms of the 2 project areas, the Clearwater project is pretty straightforward. It's about connecting downtown Clearwater to Clearwater Beach with a possible stop at the aquarium midway, utilizing the causeway. What we've discovered in a lot of our consultations with people is that while this began as a project about connecting downtown Clearwater to Clearwater Beach, we discovered that there was equal, if not more, interest in connecting Clearwater Beach with downtown. And this idea of actually unifying these 3 districts, Clearwater Beach, Aquarium, and downtown, as a simple means of people to move back and forth between these areas. The St. Pete project is a little more amorphous, to be perfectly honest. It's a larger area. There's more attractors, there's more stuff. And we're still working through what that means. We have the Tropicana field site, clearly. We have questions about the I-175, which may or may not come down. We're dealing with Ford Pinellas on learning more about that. We have the downtown core, we have the pier. We also have the innovation district and the university and the hospital. And we also learned before we even got into this about the Warehouse Arts District and a desire to connect the Warehouse Arts District. One of the common themes that's been coming up in our conversations with people is this idea of north-south connectivity, that the 175 has really divided St. Pete, really divided communities to the south of the 175. And is there a way here to quickly, cheaply, and easily solve some of those problems, perhaps connecting some of these southern communities to the Trop site, Central Avenue first, and the First Avenue busway. But again, we're still very early stage in that. So what we're really looking for from you guys right now at this stage, the reason we've gone through these engagement sessions with a whole lot of people is we want to know what you guys want and what you don't want, what you like, what you don't like, what your gut reaction is, and what are the potential challenges we're going to run into as we go along this way. we want to make sure that we design the best thing possible so that it stands a fighting chance of getting through the feasibility process. Having said that, we've been given clear latitude for us to come back and say, this isn't feasible, or one is feasible and one is feasible. We've really been given that permission. We've not been tasked with shoving a gondola down anyone's throat. It's really about, are these good projects? Are they viable? Are they feasible according to the criteria that's been given to us?
And Stephen, if I can jump in, it's important to note that the two projects are functionally separated and there's no connection. We're not competing one project against the other. Both are going to be analyzed independently and may have different results.
Correct. Yes, that's a really good point to make, Steve. So
okay.
At this
and
point,
with regards to input, and Jennifer, please correct us if this is not the correct path forward, but I think we would welcome any questions or comments, perhaps by email, and if it would be appropriate for Jennifer to either provide our contact information following this meeting or redirect any inquiries, we'd be welcome to hear those.
I can do that. I know that we do usually offer our members to ask the questions during the meeting, if that's okay with you.
Yep, no, we certainly have time for that, but if there's follow-up things that time
definitely
doesn't allow, or things that pop into people's minds later, we're happy to do that as well.
Yeah, we'll send out their contact information after today's meeting.
Great.
And so I do have some hands up here, so we're going to go ahead with Rick first.
Hey, good afternoon. Thank you. Great presentation. Just a couple comments or questions, and they don't need to be addressed, but hopefully they would be in future updates. One is the availability of federal funding or match for these type of projects for gondolas specifically. Are the gondolas climate controlled? Do they have AC? And then the third one would be, this area is highly susceptible to afternoon thunderstorms that can quickly, whip up winds greater than the max allowable. So how does that work from an operational perspective? Thank you.
In terms of climate control, the cabins can be climate controlled. There are two different mechanisms for doing that. The TriCable admittedly has a better system for providing climate control. So that's one of the reasons that we are looking at it, but we are vetting the systems that exist for the MonoCable as well, should we recommend a MonoCable. In terms of lightning, you're totally right about that. And that's something that we're focused a lot on right now. One of the interesting things is in Telluride, Colorado, there's an interesting case there where they had lightning problems, and then they implemented lightning protection and prevention systems that changed dramatically their shutdown periods because of that. So this is actually one of those parts of the consultation process we're going to be doing, is talking with Telluride, learning about that more, especially because they're unique in the world because they have a before and after situation. So we are going to look at that. In terms of federal funding, I believe I saw Brian Pissarro on that. He might know a little bit more about that. Brian?
Yes. Federal Transit Administration does consider aerial gondolas as a form of transit. In fact, it's one of the forms of transit that is reported in the National Transit Database. So it is eligible for FTA funding.
Thank you very much. Looking forward to it.
Okay, next question.
Yep, we've got Lang River White up next.
I also wanted to ask about the climate control, my first issue, because Disney did put in a gondola system in the last 2 years, and Disney doesn't make very many mistakes, but I believe they did make a mistake in that those gondolas are not climate controlled, and riding them in the summer is horrible. And to be a business person and board something and it not be climate controlled, that it would not be conducive. My other comment has to do with the fact that last week I attended the FDOT Mobility Vision Stakeholders meeting. And a lot of that conversation centered around what is the future of transit in Florida. And a lot of the central thinking is moving more towards on demand. And I would see this as being able to be marketed as being on demand.
Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly with both points you've made. You know, it's not quite on demand, but it's about as close to on demand as you can get without being on demand, right? You know, it's almost like, it's like those moving escalators on a sidewalk. There's just always, you know, there's always capacity available. So I would agree with you on that. In terms of the climatization issue, Disney's very interesting because it cuts both ways, right? It's an example that's right in your backyard, but I would agree with you that there are certain flaws in that system. And Steve Giroux and I actually intentionally went to Disney to tour that system to understand better how it works. We actually got a behind the scenes, you know, tour and meeting and conversation in that. And we agree with you. And Steve, please cut me off if you disagree with me on this. But the climatization is a curious decision for Disney to make. It's a very curious decision. It has passive ventilation, which means that the windows open and as it moves, you have ventilation. It has anti-glare film on the cabins, but it doesn't have either active ventilation, which means fans that push air through the cabin, especially in the event that the system slows down or perhaps stops on occasion. And it clearly does not have air conditioning. So we do find that curious, and we're putting a lot of our effort and thinking into that issue. But it is important to know that the TriCable air conditioning, I'm not going to say is standard, but it is a non-controversial feature to implement on a TriCable system.
One of the things we're also exploring is active ventilation. So that may just be fans or bringing outside air into a cabin, but giving passengers the perception of moving air at a higher rate than what's provided just by having louvers on the vehicle. So similar to the blower above you in an airplane seat, perhaps just having that perception of moving air might increase the level of comfort so it's acceptable. But that's something that we're working through and we need to develop an opinion of and a recommendation for as the project proceeds.
And it may even be in a place like Florida that all three are necessary, or all four, right? That you have the anti-glare film, you have the passive ventilation, you have the active ventilation, and you have air conditioning. You know, that may be, and maybe they're not all operating at the same time, but that in certain situations, one is being utilized and one is not. But again, we're very early in the process, and trust me on this, the climatization issue is such a very, very big matter for us. It's almost one of the top priorities.
Okay, we probably have time for one more question.
Okay, Bill Johnson was next.
Thank you. I'm most interested in Clearwater because I can relate to that far better. What is the objective of the project? Is it to enhance tourism by creating an attraction that people can ride? Or is it actually moving people when the roads are congested?
It's an excellent question, and what we see it is it's both. And this is something that's sometimes hard for people to wrap their minds around because we're all used to buses and streetcars and that. The cable car industry in urban environments like Clearwater works in what we call the hybrid market, where it operates as both public transit but also as a novelty for recreational users. I think we can all agree that there's going to be a certain percentage of children and grandkids that are going to nag their parents and grandparents onto that system, even though they're staying at the hotel, right down on the beach. And those people are going to be willing to pay a certain price in order to do that. But when it comes to alleviating traffic on the causeway, yes, that's a major issue and major thing that we're thinking. And it's not just about getting people from downtown to the beach. It's also about getting people from the beach and not having to deal with the traffic and get to downtown. It's also about parking. We know the state of parking in Clearwater Beach is expensive. There's a lot of parking and a lot of it is often full. And people spend a lot of time circling around Clearwater Beach trying to find the best parking space. Having said that, we know that downtown Clearwater, parking is cheap, parking is plentiful, and there's a lot of it downtown. So we're almost seeing this as a way of, if we connect the two, how does that solve that problem? It also, of course, accessing the aquarium is it's a major node within there. So we don't see this as one or the other, we see it as both. And what we're gonna do as we go through this process is figure out what the different target markets are and figure out how to price each target market accordingly. And that's part of the study objective. Does that satisfy you?
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, I see two more hands, so if you can keep them short, we'll go. Karen, you're next.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to let you know as well that Bill is on the line now, Bill Roberts.
I know
Go ahead
that.
and take- Okay,
Yeah.
great. Thank
We're
you.
gonna pass the baton in a little minute.
I gotcha. Okay, thank you, Karen. Go ahead.
Okay, so thank you for the presentation. It was wonderful. I would like to know what the operating costs. I know you have a lot of things juggled up in the air, but are we looking at a situation where taxpayers are paying for most of this? Or is there going to be a P3? What are we looking at as far as operation and maintenance costs? And at what point, what's the percentage of riders that we need to make this work in a positive, that we're not just relying on taxpayers to make the cable move?
And that's an excellent question. And that's actually one of the top things that we're tasked with in this study, is figuring out, and we're going to be working with stakeholders, and HRNA is going to be tasked primarily with developing the financial model of this. And we're trying to figure out what that is. Is it going to be a PPP? We don't know. Is it going to be privately owned? Is it going to be publicly owned? And of course, the procurement mechanism associated with any of those three are going to be different. And your point about the taxpayers paying for it is an interesting question, because virtually every piece of public transit in the Western world is subsidized, and oftentimes heavily subsidized, by taxpayer dollars. And that's one of those questions that we need to understand, if in this context that's acceptable, or if it needs to be self-sustaining. And if it needs to be self-sustaining, we need to figure that out. And that's a criteria that we need to understand better. And we might discover, for example, maybe Clearwater is capable of standing on its own financially, but St. Pete does need a subsidy, or vice versa. We don't know right now. So, your point is well taken. You're not the first person to bring that up. And the best answer I can give you is, we don't know yet, but we're going to find out.
Okay, and the last question is from Josh.
Thank you, Chair. My question really is pretty simple. In most transit projects that are studied at this phase, there's at least some consideration given to transit-oriented development. I'm curious, in your experience, if there's been much research about the TOD associated with gondola systems, and if it's part of this scope.
TOD is not really part of this scope, simply because it's out of scope of it. We're going to talk about it in generalities, but transit-oriented development with a cable car is no different than transit-oriented development with a subway, or with a bus network, or a light rail, or a streetcar. It's the same thing, right? It's about co-locating activity centers and jobs and places to live, work, and play in close proximity to transit. That's really what TOD is. So what I would say is that, yes, it absolutely can be done. No, it is not necessarily a part of the study, but it will be spoken to.
Okay, and Jennifer, I believe, has agreed to pass on the contact information for other questions and just general comments. We really thank you. This is very interesting, and it certainly aids the connectivity, if you will, of different modes of transit. And with that, I know our esteemed chairman is on the line, and I pass the baton to him.
Well,
Bill?
thank you, Bob. I appreciate you jumping in there, and I apologize to the committee for being late. Guys, I appreciate this presentation. I think there's a lot of good information here, and hopefully our committee will be able to spread the word and disabuse people of the misinformation and direct good questions toward you while you're in this fact-finding stage. Thanks for coming.
Appreciate it. Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you very much.